So, Dr. Murray, welcome to the show. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional work?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Um, I am an exercise physiologist by training. So, exercise physiologists study how the body responds to exercise and adapts to training. That's kind of the simplest definition. And I began my career as an exercise physiologist, as most do, and of my vintage anyway, which is as a college professor. And I thought I'd start and end my career in just that job. And that was true for the first 8 years. But then I had an opportunity to join the Gatorade company that kind of came out of the blue in a sense. And I thought, I've been in academia in the university setting for a long time now with all my schooling and now 8 years of being a professor. Maybe it's time to try something different. And I was young enough that I could, go back to academia if the corporate world didn't work out. But I ended up being at Gatorade for the next 23 years. I was one of the co-founders of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, and I served as the director of GSSI from 1985 to 2008. And since 2008, I've been working as a consultant, helping companies large and small with kind of targeted expertise in exercise science and sports nutrition to try to provide them some expertise that they might not have in-house, or at least a different perspective on some of the issues they're dealing with. So that's what's been keeping me busy for the last dozen years.
Right. Okay. And I came across you because I tuned into an episode of that triathlon show. I don't know when it was released, but it was, and then you were talking about a paper that you'd written. So I went and got that, and that was really interesting to me as well. So that was all about, glycogen, glucose, carbohydrate, that kind of stuff. Is that where your specialty has always been, or is that just part of what your interests are?
That's just part of it. I have been interested in exercise nutrition, sports nutrition for a long time, particularly in the Gatorade years, because there was a firm overlap with hydration and carbohydrate metabolism and electrolyte balance. And Gatorade has had and still has a variety of other products in the sports nutrition area for athletes. And so, my expertise sort of had to naturally expand into those areas. And glycogen is one of them.
Yeah. And I was reading another paper by you recently that was it was talking about sodium intake as well, because obviously when you're exercising, there's only so much you can put in your body, and you kind of have a number of different things you need to replenish and restore and that kind of thing. So I suppose that comes into the equation when you're looking at Gatorade products. Is right, we can get the carbohydrate right, but what about the sodium, and are there other things that need to be, optimized?
Yeah, well, whenever we're physically active, and particularly when we're physically active and sweating, then water, sugar, and salt become the three most important nutrients that we have to replace. And doing so helps us maintain our physiological functions, provides a little extra energy that our muscles and even our central nervous system enjoy, and provides electrolytes, primarily being sodium, being most important, to help us maintain that hydration level.
Okay. Well, I think we'll stick to the glucose glycogen side of things today, if that's okay, because it's a very complicated topic anyway. At least I find it complicated. So I'll not delve too much into the sodium and other electrolyte type stuff. But I wondered if before we get into it, could we, just to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about, maybe define some of the terms. Now, I'm pretty sure most people are going to be somewhat familiar with some of the terms like glucose and glycogen and carbohydrate, but just could you just start us out on the right footing by defining some of those terms, and maybe even sugar as well? What are these things? What's the differences between them, and that kind of stuff?
All right, good. Well, my goal here will be to demystify this for everybody.
Okay,
because it shouldn't be complicated, and it should be practical and relevant and useful to athletes of all stripes. So let me try my best here. Sugars simply refer to the simplest forms of carbohydrates. And carbohydrates, as most people recognize, those macronutrients, macro meaning large, so we eat them in large quantities. The macronutrients that are found in fruits and vegetables and grains, So breakfast cereals and pastas and breads and fruits and veggies all contain carbohydrates, and typically fairly complex carbohydrates. In other words, all these sugars combine together to form a complex carbohydrate, and they stick end to end and they branch off and they form the type of carbohydrate you might find in a potato, for example. And in their simplest forms are the type of carbohydrates that we might find in a soft drink or in candies. So that's sugar. And sugar is important because our body and our brain and our muscles run on sugar. And that sugar is glucose. Glucose is the energy, the carbohydrate energy that our brain and muscles not only prefer, but sort of are obligatory users of. All our metabolic machinery is geared toward breaking down glucose to form the energy that's needed to sustain physical activity, to sustain muscle contractions, as well as the hundreds of thousands of other processes that happen inside cells. They need ATP energy, and that ATP energy comes from glucose as well as from fats. Breaking those two things down creates the ATP molecules that our muscles and brain use and all cells use to sustain their activities. And glycogen is simply a convenient storage form for those glucose molecules that aren't immediately used. Blood sugar refers to blood glucose. Whenever we talk about blood sugar, we're really talking about blood glucose. And there's two ways that the blood glucose level is maintained. Of course, we've all felt the consequences when our blood sugar drops too low because we've exercised too long without eating or simply gone too long between meals, and we really feel that the drag on our energy levels, as well as some other symptoms perhaps, when blood sugar drops too low. We maintain that blood sugar, number one, by eating periodically throughout the day. It provides carbohydrate, sugars, and specifically glucose. And our liver is also a storage place for glycogen. And it's the liver glycogen that breaks down to help maintain our blood sugar levels throughout the day. So when blood sugar levels begin to drop, the liver increases its output of glucose and it levels off our blood sugar. And obviously that's critically important. Well, muscle also has the ability to store glycogen, and it does so in sort of a lesser concentration than liver is able to do it. But because we have so much more muscle than we have liver, the total amount of glycogen in muscle is far greater than it is in liver. But unfortunately, the glycogen that's in muscle can only be used by muscle. It can't be broken down and released into the bloodstream. So it's the liver's primary job to provide that maintenance of blood sugar. That all makes sense so far?
I think so. So we've got essentially one thing I was wondering, are sugar and glucose the same thing or are they different?
Yeah, glucose is a form of sugar.
Okay. Right.
Glucose and fructose and galactose, these are all sugars.
Right. And then, so the liver so the glycogen is just a storage vehicle for glucose. Is that?
That's exactly right. And it doesn't need to be more complicated than that.
And so we have a fairly substantial storage place in the liver and also in the muscles. And that's where we keep the glycogen so that when we need glucose, we can access it. Is that pretty much it?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So during exercise, as our muscles are using glucose to form energy, they draw that glucose from their muscle glycogen stores that are within each and every muscle cell and from the bloodstream. The muscles can take glucose molecules from the bloodstream, get them inside the muscle cell, and either break them down for energy, or during rest after a meal, the muscles will take the glucose out of the bloodstream and reform muscle glycogen that's been broken down during training or competition.
Okay. And
so it's a nice system.
Yeah. And you mentioned ATP as well there, and just for listeners who aren't familiar with that, could you just explain a little bit, like what is ATP and how is it related to energy and exercise?
Sure. Well, ATP is the energy source for all the cells in our body. And ATP is just shorthand for a long scientific word called adenosine triphosphate. And it's just a sort of a descriptor of what that molecule looks like and how it's structured. And ATP is an energy source that our muscles will break down in order to help them contract and relax. And of course, that's exactly what muscles are doing anytime we're physically active. They're contracting and relaxing repetitively. And ATP is the energy that allows that to happen.
Okay. And then carbohydrate, is carbohydrate the sort of food form of glucose? So we take the food, which is made up of carbohydrates, we eat that, and then we turn it into glucose, and that's in our blood. And then if we've got any extra, we store that as glycogen. That's a simplistic way. Is that
exactly.
Right? Okay. Cool.
All right. Well, let's walk through the whole process here. Let's say we're eating an energy bar or a sandwich or a complete dinner. We're going to be consuming carbohydrates and fats and proteins and a whole variety of other nutrients. And we chew those up. We get them down into the stomach. The stomach churns them around, breaks them down a little bit, spurts them in a fairly controlled manner into our small intestine. And that's where the real action occurs in terms of digestion. Mm-hmm. So all those complex starches that we find in fruits and vegetables are broken down in the small intestine into individual glucose molecules primarily. Those glucose molecules are absorbed into the bloodstream and travel to the liver, which takes out what it wants. It continues on into the bloodstream, and any other cell in the body, including muscles, can take that up. The same happens with fats that are broken down into individual, what are called fatty acids, which is just a less complex form of the fat that we consume. And likewise with proteins, they're broken down into individual amino acids that comprise the protein in the first place. All that stuff is absorbed and distributed throughout the body.
Okay, and I think we'll come back to fatty acids a little bit later, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. But
sure,
how do we work out how much carbohydrate we need? Because depending on the person and their activity levels and their size, like how is there some sort of formula or way we can work out how much we need each day?
Well, there's some guidelines, some rule of thumb guidelines, and like all rule of thumb guidelines, they don't fit everybody every day for every purpose. But the general idea is the more physically active we are. So if we have a person who's, going to the gym and exercising for 30 minutes a day at one extreme to somebody who's training for an Ironman or ultra endurance event and might be working out 3 times a day for a total of 6 hours. These two individuals, these two extremes have very different nutrient needs, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And on the far extreme, where somebody's exercising multiple hours a day, their need for carbohydrate is large. And so the rule of thumb there is to consume 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day. So you have a 70-kilo athlete, that's 700 grams of carbohydrate. That alone is 2,800 calories. But if you're exercising 6 hours a day, you're going to need 4,000, 5,000 calories, depending on your body size. So, it's all very doable.
And what about, so if we take that same 70 kilogram athlete, and I don't know pounds off the top of my head how to convert it, but I weigh pretty much 70 kilograms.
Okay, good. Wow, it was a good number then.
But I certainly don't exercise 6 hours a day. So how would I understand how many grams of carbohydrate I might need? So let's say I do about an hour a day on average.
Yeah. Well, then you can get by with half that amount, with 5. So 5 times 70, 350.
Yeah.
It's 1,400 calories a day of carbohydrate.
Or
which you're probably eating
350 grams, is that?
What's that?
350
350 grams. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And you're probably consuming somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 calories a day, I would guess. Mm-hmm. So, 1,400 calories of those should be carbohydrate. That gets you right about where you should be.
Okay. And then that's in order to maintain a level of glycogen in my body so that it's available for exercise. Is that correct?
That's correct. It'll keep your glycogen levels from dropping too low to the point where they'd be interfering with your ability to train and compete.
And what happens when they drop too low?
Well, then we really feel it. That's what's often called as hitting the wall or bonking, during endurance events, and just feeling that low energy and inability to train hard. That's typically what low muscle glycogen feels like. And interestingly enough, like muscle glycogen doesn't have to drop to zero, and rarely does, because that would be bad for muscle cells. But if it drops below a threshold level, that's enough to cause the muscle to restrict its use of glycogen, because it's saying, hey, my fuel tank's dropping way too low. I'm going to switch over to fats more and try to save what little muscle glycogen I have left. And when that happens, we have to slow down, because fats just can't be broken down as fast as carbohydrate. And so our ability to exercise at an intense level is restricted.
So that's why when you bonk or you hit the wall, you don't necessarily sort of sit down on the ground and be unable to move, but you're unable to stay in that same pace. So if we take a marathon example, if I'm sort of at my race pace and I'm going for, 4 hours, but then my glycogen levels in my body get too low, I'll feel that horrible feeling that you're describing that I think most people will be familiar with. And I'll be able to keep going, but I'll have to slow down. And sometimes I have to slow down to a walk. And that's because I can no longer burn glucose. I have to burn fatty acids. Is that right?
Yeah. The proportion changes. Whenever we're engaged in high intensity exercise, we're burning, 60% of our energy or more is going to be coming from glucose. Right. And the remainder from fat. But when we hit that threshold level of muscle glycogen, when we hit the wall, now that proportion switches. We're burning mostly fat and far less carbohydrate. And because of that, we kind of have to gear back. And our muscles simply can't work the way they did before. So we have to slow our running pace, our cycling pace, our swimming pace to accommodate for that shift in fuel sources.
So the idea with maintaining your adequate levels of glycogen storage through the dietary intake you've been talking about is to make sure that happens either later or doesn't happen at all, depending on the event, because you want to be able to sustain a certain pace, which is going to require a certain amount of use of glucose. So if we had to switch to fatty acids, we'd slow down. But so we want to have enough glycogen in our body that we can sustain that pace.
Yes,
otherwise we'd have to slow down. Is that okay?
Yeah. And you can imagine, just let me see if I can paint this picture with words. But if you start a workout really well nourished and your muscle glycogen levels are fairly high, over the course of that workout, they're going to drop, right? Because we're using muscle glycogen. And hopefully they don't drop too low or below that threshold, because we definitely feel it, and we'd have a horrible workout at the end. But then in the succeeding 12 hours, if you're working out 2 times a day, or 24 hours, if you're just working out once a day, we're going to eat and drink, and that's going to provide additional carbohydrate, additional glucose, and our muscle glycogen levels are going to climb. Next time we work out, drop. Eat and drink, climb. Drop, climb. And if we don't allow enough time for that to happen, then we start at a high level, and progressively we get sort of lower over the course of the week, because you just don't have enough time. It's a slow process to replace muscle glycogen, even under the best of circumstances. And so then we end up really lagging, really dragging by the end of the week, because our muscle glycogen levels are so low that we're reliant now more on fat than carbohydrate.
That makes sense, because sometimes, like particularly in the evening, maybe I'll be riding home from work, or I'll be on a run or something, and I feel like I bonk, and I'm just like, and I'll walk for like 10 minutes, and then I can usually muster up and keep going at a slower pace. And I'm like, well, it's the afternoon, so I've eaten breakfast and lunch, and I've often had a snack, and I'm like, why am I so low? But it may be that during the week, I've just been gradually, not quite topping up as much as I consume, as much as I used.
Yeah.
And each day it's dropped a little bit lower. So my sort of starting point, if I was a car, my fuel tank has been a little bit less full each time I start. And then by that fourth or fifth workout of the week, I'm starting with hardly anything and I don't realize it. Is that what's going on? Okay.
That's exactly right. There's all sorts of good reasons for us to take rest days. And one of them is to allow that replenishment of muscle glycogen stores. Because if we take 24 hours off or do very low level activity where we're not using a lot of muscle glycogen, then we give our muscle glycogen a chance to rebound if we're eating and drinking appropriately, putting enough carbohydrate back into the system. Mm-hmm. And, that's one of the values of having a rest day at least once a week, and maybe more if, for athletes who are really training at a high intensity for a long period of time.
And so then would it matter if your training was more at a slower pace but a larger volume, or if you're doing more, let's say, HIIT type workouts or intervals where you're going very quick but the workout's maybe 30 or 40 minutes? Is one of them, those types of exercise, more sort of glycogen thirsty, or are they pretty similar?
Yeah, interestingly enough, they can be pretty similar. That's a great question. With HIIT interval type of workouts, muscle glycogen use is extremely high. And, the more intense we exercise, the greater the reliance on muscle glycogen. So we do a HIIT workout, muscle glycogen levels are going to drop precipitously. We do a slower, long, slow distance workout. The rate at which muscle glycogen breaks down is far less than it is during interval training. But because we're going for such a long period of time, the overall decrease in muscle glycogen can be similar. So either type of training will drop muscle glycogen.
And am I using the right term here, glycogen supercompensation? Is that where you get a sort of training effect on your glycogen storage?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the supercompensation of glycogen simply refers to having a higher than normal level of glycogen in your system. And for endurance events, that's beautiful. Yeah, that's exactly what we want to achieve before an important competition, to make sure our glycogen stores are not only topped off, but maybe even more so. Two things at least make that happen. One is just training, because as our muscle glycogen goes up and down over the course of weeks and months of training, our muscles adapt accordingly. And one of the ways they adapt is to improve their ability to store muscle glycogen, and they store more of it. And then as we get closer to an important competition, as we ease off the training and have more time for muscle glycogen to replenish, and we eat more carbohydrate, that causes muscle glycogen levels to go up and up and up, and they supercompensate. So we have a larger fuel tank at the beginning of that competition, and that's always a good thing.
And is that where tapering comes into the equation for a race?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that tapering can be effective, particularly in endurance events.
Right, okay. And so we talked a little bit, you were saying that, we can either get it from fatty acids or from glucose. And the glucose we get from our glycogen stores. And if they're running low, we'll use fatty acids, which we'll get from fat storage.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about, burning fat for fuel kind of thing, and trying to train your body to run on fats. These are some of the terms that I've heard thrown around a lot. So where does that fit in here? Would that be facilitated by me just being a bit rubbish at not restoring my glycogen, and I could just have low glycogen, so I'll have to use fats? Or is that not how it works? Can you sort of reconcile those for me?
Sure. Well, first of all, just by training, without doing any other type of manipulations with diet or the way in which we train, our body naturally adapts to become better at burning fats, because it's to the muscle's advantage, isn't it? Let's burn more fats and we'll save the carbohydrate, because that's what muscles are geared to do. They want to conserve the carbohydrate for those occasions when we need it for high intensity efforts. So it makes all sorts of sense for just training in general to improve our ability to burn fat. So with that in mind, we can also improve our ability to burn fat by manipulating certain things about our diet and training. And you probably heard the phrase train low, compete high, or train low, sleep low. There's all sorts of different variations of this, but the train low refers to training with low muscle glycogen levels. And sleeping low refers to training with sleeping with low muscle glycogen levels. And training high refers to just the opposite, training with high muscle glycogen levels. So the theoretical advantage, and I think it's probably, more real than theoretical at this point in time, is that whenever our muscle glycogen levels drop low and remain low, our muscle cells get hangry. They really want glucose, and if we deprive them of glucose, they're going to do whatever they can to take advantage of glucose when it eventually gets there. And so they change some of their metabolic machinery. They increase some certain enzymes within each muscle cell, so that when carbohydrate becomes available, they can quickly and effectively replenish muscle glycogen stores. So we become better at storing muscle glycogen. We also, in those train low periods, become better at using fat for energy, because the muscle has no choice. It has to rely on something. And so it shifts its metabolic machinery to become better able to burn fatty acids. So if we train low simply by not eating a lot of carbohydrates between training sessions, that gives us our muscles a greater impetus, a stimulus to burn more fat and store more glycogen when the carbohydrate becomes available. The downside of that is we feel crappy.
Right.
Training low, as you mentioned before, is not a good feeling. And so psychologically, it's a real challenge for athletes to suffer through those times. Another strategy is to sleep low. So you exercise in the late afternoon or evening. You restrict your carbohydrate intake. Doesn't mean you don't eat any carbs, but you eat only a few carbs before bedtime. And so in all those many hours after your workout and during your sleep, your muscle glycogen is low, and there's that stimulus to cause the muscles to become better at storing and using glycogen. And that's what they do. So you get up the next morning and you can train low again if you can suffer through that. Or you eat more carbohydrate before your workout, so you jumpstart your muscles' recovery to restore that glycogen.
Is there a downside to just doing that all the time? Being in a sort of constant, are you at some point, are just the wheels going to fall off, or what? I don't know.
Yeah, the wheels will definitely fall off before too long, because then we enter a state of overtraining. And that's something we all want to avoid.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about the type of overtraining that either takes many months to overcome, or for most of us, a few days of rest or low level activity where we back off until we feel that we're ready to push it again. But yeah, low muscle glycogen levels can definitely cause that to happen.
And this just occurred to me, is that where something like relative energy deficiency comes in? Is this sort of longer term, slightly below what I need glycogen replenishment? So you don't maybe notice it. You're not sort of bonking on every workout, but you sort of get used to feeling not quite so sharp. But over the longer term, you're going to have, other health implications and injury implications, because you're just not, it's like you've just got a fuel tank that you're just never filling up.
That's exactly right. And it's not only that relative energy deficiency, it's the fact that most of us will sort of accidentally train low, because we get busy, we forget to eat, we don't eat enough carbs, and we experience what you described earlier, where by the end of a training week, we're dragging. And, we didn't do that on purpose, but we did it accidentally. Okay. Well, there's a benefit to that if we give ourselves enough time to recover until we're ready to get back to training as we normally would.
So maybe a more like a professional athlete, like you described, who's, training multiple times a day, doing, I don't know, maybe 20 plus hours a week. They can be quite strategic. They want to be eating a large amount of carbohydrate all the time, but then they might, once every week, once every second week, they might do this sleep low, train low kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas someone, like recreational athletes like myself might, just expect that sometimes my carbohydrate is just going to be a bit low and I just slow down for that workout when I feel it and still keep going. And that'll get that similar kind of stimulus, just not quite as sharp or scheduled.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. I don't see any reason for recreational athletes to try these different types of periodized nutrition, is what it's called. It just doesn't make sense. The risk is greater than the reward. And but if you're a pro triathlete or cyclist, then it's certainly worth trying, because you have more bandwidth during your day to accomplish those things.
Yeah, it's almost like another lever to pull, right? If you're a professional, there's lots of different ways you can stress your body in different fashions to try and stimulate adaptation, and you're almost sort of looking for more. So this is another one. But for recreational athletes, we don't want to be it's probably not the low-hanging fruit. It'd be better to focus on replenishing our glycogen sufficiently, so that we can train properly and not have this sort of gradual over time decrease in our ability to train, because if that's going on for months at a time, our training sessions are going to be compromised pretty much all the time.
Yeah. And I think one of the, this is just an observation based on some of my earlier coaching of swimmers and all the work we did with elite athletes at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. And that is that successful elite athletes have a sixth sense for when to push and when to back off, for when they need to rest, and when they need to really push it hard. That's been a common denominator, regardless of the sport. Elite athletes really know their bodies well. They listen to their bodies, and they benefit from that. And they're not doing anything typically just based on anything other than just their intuition.
Yeah. So paying attention to how you're feeling, if you're noticing, like myself, say that feeling, say I was getting that quite often, maybe once a week, maybe twice a week, or once every second week. And it's like, I'm obviously not replenishing what I'm using here. So It's just paying attention to that feeling, and that's probably sufficient, rather than needing to work out exactly how much carbohydrate I'm eating each day and how much I'm burning. I can go off feel, but as long as I pay attention.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe you've heard me tell this story before, but it's a good one because it really emphasizes what we're talking about. And years ago, when Mark Allen was still competing in triathlons, we had him come to the Gatorade Sports Science Institute for some testing, and eventually invited him to be one of our guests at a Super Bowl that was held in Atlanta, Georgia. And the weather was terrible at that Super Bowl. So all of us who wanted to work out had to find places to work out indoors. And fortunately, next to our hotel was an indoor fitness center with an indoor track. And I distinctly remember getting on that track, and, this is January or February, and, plodding my way around. And after I was running for maybe 15 minutes, I saw Mark Allen get on the track, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be so embarrassed. He's going to lap me, all sorts of times. But it never happened. In fact, I ended up lapping him.
Right.
And when I saw him later that day, I said, are you injured? Are you sick? What's going on? And he said, no. He said, I've taken my 2 months off or 3 months off after Hawaii. And this is how I feel every year when I start training again. He said, I can barely run 10-minute miles. And I can't even believe that I'm ever going to be able to run a 6-minute mile.
Right.
But, I just put one foot in front of the other. I don't push it. And slowly it comes back to me. And I thought, man, what a smart guy.
Yeah.
And he does this, and he did it year after year, feeling the same way, trudging through the early stages, but just believing in himself and his body and his training method. And wow, the success he had.
Yeah, I think most of us, because we don't have that sort of track record to look back on, we're always a little worried that we're doing something wrong. So if we see our pace is slower on a particular, we always do some 10K each week, and we see the pace slowing, we start freaking out. and
Yeah.
thinking we're doing something wrong. So, but having that faith in the process, I think, comes from, time, experience, but also paying attention, like you said, like noticing the ebbs and flows of the year or the month.
Yeah. And I think for most competitive athletes, particularly recreational athletes, their greatest enemy is working too hard. It's not working hard enough.
Right.
We overdo it because, as you described, you get to that case where your 10K time has fallen off and you think, oh man, I got to work harder, instead of thinking, this is an indication I need to back off a little bit and let my body recuperate.
Yeah, and that might be one of the things you look at is, what am I doing with regards to carbohydrate intake? Am I actually replenishing my glycogen? Is my performance isn't suffering because of my lack of effort? It's perhaps my lack of rest and my lack of fuel.
Yeah, sure. And there, it's not only muscle glycogen that can cause us to feel fatigue. We could have muscle damage and just, the muscle just hasn't had a time to recuperate in all sorts of different ways. But whenever we have rest and recovery days, those are days when we need to focus on consuming enough carbohydrate during the course of that 24 hours or however long it is to make sure that the next time we start to train, our muscle glycogen stores are topped off.
So, I know what's going to be going through many of the listeners' heads, and certainly it's something for me that I've had trouble reconciling is carbs in recent years have got a very bad rap, right? They're not as popular as they used to be. And for someone who is running perhaps to lose weight and they're trying to maybe limit carbohydrate in their diet such that they run an energy deficit because they want, loss of body fat, right? They want to burn more energy than they're using. Right. How does this fit in for them? Should they be deliberately allowing this depletion and this sort of not quite replenishing the glycogen that they're using? Or is that counterproductive in some way? Does it affect their training in a negative way that would, what would you say to someone who's concerned about eating this or eating as much carbohydrate as we think they need?
Yeah, well, anytime we restrict carbohydrate during training, we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're going to make it tougher on ourselves. So for individuals who want to lose weight and still continue to train, the best thing to do is just reduce the amount of fat in our diet. Reduce those calories, maintain our carbohydrate intake so we're replenishing muscle glycogen and able to train at a high intensity and therefore burn more calories, and just try to cut back on fat in the diet. Just do whatever it takes to reduce our fat intake.
So the reduction of fat will reduce the daily calorie intake.
Yeah.
The carbohydrate will go towards replenishing the glycogen. And the fat, if you're looking to run a caloric deficit, you don't need the calories from fat. Is that about right?
Exactly.
Because something I've often wondered about is, they talk about burning fat for fuel. And so then, diets where you'll deliberately consume more fat have become popular. But my thought with that is even, I'm within my recommended body weight, but as I understand it, I still have a lot of fat on my body, so much that I could probably never use it all.
Right.
So why do I need to take more in order to use it for fuel? I don't know. Am I missing the point there?
Well, the point of a high fat diet is to increase our muscles' ability to use the fat. And that's one way we can do it in conjunction with training, because that does it, as I explained earlier, all in and of itself. So you have the increased fat burning ability that comes with training, and you can increase that a wee bit further by increasing the fat in our diet and decreasing the carbohydrate intake. So we're again causing the muscle to shift its focus more to fats than to carbohydrate. But
and something
we
else
have to slow down as a result. That's the downside.
Something else you mentioned in your interview with Michael Erickson was, if you do have this depleted glycogen state during your training, you're going to get a lot more hungry afterwards. And I didn't really think about that before, because I would typically not fuel or not take any gels or sports drinks or anything on workouts that are a bit shorter, or even if I just didn't feel I needed. But sometimes I'll get home and I'm just starving.
Yeah.
And you were saying that perhaps that's for your diet related goals or your body composition goals, that's going to compromise your ability to achieve this body composition goal, because yes, during your training you've got low glucose and glycogen, but afterwards you're getting home and eating more because you're so hungry.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some good research along these lines. I mean, it's counterintuitive for people to think, well, geez, I'm trying to lose weight. Why do I want to take in calories while I'm trying to lose weight? It doesn't make any sense. But if you think of it as a way to reduce your appetite, so you don't overeat, you don't rip the door off your refrigerator when you get home, then it makes a lot more sense. And that's exactly what consuming a little bit of carbohydrate as a sports drink or an energy gel or a bar does. It helps us curb that hunger. And in addition, it helps us exercise harder. So we're actually going to burn more calories. We'll be able to exercise harder and longer when we take in extra carbohydrate during training.
And so many runners use the term fueling, right, for workouts, is when you're taking gels or sports drinks and consuming them during the run or during the ride or whatever it is, in order to replenish the glucose that you've lost, or some of it. How long does a workout, or how hard of a workout does it need to be in order that is necessary? Do we need to be fueling all our workouts or is it just a certain kind?
Well, anytime you want to get the most out of your body during a workout, then consuming carbohydrate is a good idea. So workouts that are less than 45 minutes, it's simply not enough time for us to take advantage of the carbohydrate that we consume. But I mean, as you may have learned, simply rinsing our mouth with carbohydrate is enough to help us improve our performance, because our body's that responsive to wanting and using carbohydrate. But after we get above 45 minutes of exercise, then consuming carbohydrate is a good idea, because it helps maintain blood glucose. It helps maintain the brain and nerves' ability to pull glucose out of the bloodstream, because that's part of bonking, when blood glucose drops too low. And it gives our muscles the ability to take glucose from the bloodstream, so it reduces the muscle's reliance on muscle glycogen. So doing that is a good thing anytime we're exercising hard for more than 45 minutes.
That's interesting. That's different from the way I've viewed it, and it's almost like you're saying that, generally speaking, fueling your workouts is a good idea most of the time, because even if it's a shorter workout, you're going to suppress some of your desire to eat more afterwards. So there's not going to be any net increase in caloric intake. Plus, generally, we have a tendency through the week to deplete these. so having, on my half-hour run, if I feel like having a gel or a sports drink, then that's perfectly reasonable to do. I don't need to think, it's not 45 minutes, so I shouldn't take any fueling on. Is that a good takeaway? Yeah,
because just look at it from a practical standpoint. We're not going to be consuming that many calories, but we're going to get enormous benefit from the relatively few calories that we are consuming.
Right. Yeah, because one of my clients was asking me the other day how much to fuel for his half marathon, which is obviously not going to take as long as a full marathon, and that risk of bonking isn't as high. And, I went with, I think you should, I guess I'd ask you for specifics here, but I said I think you should take a gel every 20 minutes just to make sure that whatever you can take from the gels and use, you will, so that you don't have to get it from elsewhere.
Right.
I don't know, is that grams, if you're going to be fueling a workout, or how many gels or grams of carbohydrate are we talking about here for fueling? Is there a ceiling on how much we can get in and use? How does it work?
Yeah, there is a ceiling, and there's also a basement. So we want to consume, let's say 40 grams of carbohydrate an hour.
Okay.
Right? So if you're taking gels every 20 minutes, you're going to be more than that, because each gel is 20 to 25 grams of carbohydrate. So you take a couple of them, you're already at 40 to 50 grams of carbohydrate. So anywhere between 40 and 90 grams of carbohydrate is appropriate. For shorter events, veer more toward 40. For longer endurance events, something in excess of 2 hours, you can increase it to 60, or if you can tolerate it and feel good with it, closer to 90. But once you get above 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour, then that's going to be too much, and gastric emptying will slow down, and it can cause a whole cascade of unfortunate events. Not the least of which is bloating, burping, and barfing.
Right, okay. So, and something I've not paid enough attention to historically, but a lot more recently, is that this fueling effort can be trained. You can experiment with different types of gels, food, and drinks and find what works. But also, you can take the thing that seems to work a bit better, and you can actually get better at taking more on board. Because it sounds like, just take 50 to 75 grams an hour and you'll be fine. But it's actually quite difficult, especially when you're going, like 3 gels an hour. And then you're talking about events. Sometimes there's a grisly 50K coming up in a couple of weeks here. And, a lot of people are going to take 6-7 hours to do that. And that's a lot of gels to try and actually eat. Is there a benefit to using different, in a race, for example? Is it always better to go sports drinks, gels, gummies, or is there any benefit to using more complex carbohydrates, sandwiches maybe, or if there's certain bars that people can eat?
Yeah, my advice is everybody's different. Experiment during training. Find out what combination of foods and beverages works best for you. So it can be sports drinks and sports foods. It can be a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It can be all sorts of things, depending upon how it makes you feel, how it sits in your stomach, and how you respond to it. Let's face it, if you were to sit on your couch and watch television for 6 hours, you wouldn't want to be taking the same thing every 20 minutes, would you?
Right, yeah.
And that's certainly true during exercise. So I always encourage people to experiment. Training's the perfect place to do that. Find out what works best in terms of the variety of foods and drink, as well as how much of each. And we can train our bodies to take in more fluid as well as nutrients like carbohydrate during exercise. And that's what we need to do.
And so how much, like, say, if we took one of those 500 ml bottles of Gatorade, how many grams of carbs are in those, and how would that fit in?
Yeah, that would be about 30 grams of carbohydrate.
So it's similar to a gel, really, a little more.
Yeah. And of course, the advantage of the sports drink is you're getting electrolytes and sodium, and you're getting fluid.
Yeah.
So you're ticking all of the water, sugar, and salt boxes that are important during exercise.
And that's really about trial and error and training, really, because I know for me, I have a hard time drinking a lot of sports drinks. Like I can drink a little bit, but I just find that drinking is much harder for me than eating when I'm doing longer training sessions.
Yeah. Well, then what you need to do is make the sports drink in your stomach. You consume enough water along with gels and other things and bars to get the carbohydrates and electrolytes. So you're basically making a sports drink in your stomach as you go along, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah. And you can try and add, it'd be different in different temperatures as well, wouldn't it? Because you're going to be, I think there'd be less thirst, less desire to drink if you were in a cold event and you weren't sweating much than in a hot event. So your sort of fueling strategies might differ.
Yeah, it all depends on how much sweat we're losing. So regardless of the environment, you have hockey players that are working out in a cold environment, but it's the Amazon underneath their uniform. So, they can lose an enormous amount of sweat. So it's the total sweat loss. It's the most important thing to replace that fluid, as well as get some carbohydrates and electrolytes in there.
I think you've answered on all of my questions. Is there anything that you think you would like to share with the recreational athletes out there that you think is maybe a message that's been misunderstood or anything like that before we call it a day?
Yeah, well, I'll just reiterate some of the things I said before, which is, number one, don't overcomplicate things. Enjoy your workouts, enjoy your competition, listen to your body, and then make sure you're doing the basics in terms of nutrition and hydration. We want to stay well hydrated throughout the day, and particularly while we're exercising. and we want to have enough carbohydrate to fuel our muscles and brain. That's extraordinarily important. And one of the reasons we get ourselves into trouble with doing too much is not only that we work out too hard too often, but that we're not giving our bodies a chance to recover. And nutrition and hydration is a critical part of that recovery scheme.
Wonderful. Do you have anywhere you'd like to point listeners to, anywhere we can follow you online or that kind of thing?
I don't do much on social media. They can go to my website where I have a little bit of educational information, and that's just sportscienceinsights.com.
Okay, cool. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I'll also link to the paper that I mentioned earlier, because as a resource, I thought that paper was excellent. I mean, for anyone interested in really understanding this, it wasn't so complicated that I couldn't understand what you were talking about, but it was like very practical. There was tables, there was a really nice bit where you sort of took an athlete's daily intake of food and then the carbohydrate count at the bottom, and then you said what he could have eaten in order to meet his carbohydrate. And it was really nice illustration, and there were some other things in the paper like that. So I definitely recommend listeners check that out if they're interested in this. It was a really nice summary and sort of concise for people like myself, who this isn't my area of expertise, but I want to understand the basics. I thought it was excellent. So thank you for that.
Well, good. Hey, thanks for that compliment, because that's exactly what we were shooting for. So I'm happy to hear that it came across that way.
It definitely did. Well, I'm going to stop the recording there. Thanks, Dr. Murray.
My pleasure.